So as Mary Grace said, I'm going to talk with you. Did something just come in front of that, or? Okay, there we go. About self-compassion. Just a minute. And self-compassion, is a topic that many of us have many feelings about. And so backing up a bit in this COVID time, where there are many challenges that we're all confronting, whether it's physical isolation, whether it's financial challenges, there's a gamut of emotions. And before we talk about self-compassion, I want to acknowledge to all of us that that gamut can include moments of feeling okay with the beauty of spring, okay with finding more time on our hands in this busy 21st century where we have many demands. And COVID has really required of us that we shelter in place and we slow down and we take stock. So it's okay to feel the gamut of what you're feeling, and really to sort of hold space with how we're responding to the experience. And this is how self-compassion can help us. And self-compassion really can be described as inner compassion as well. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that we all have this innate capacity to, when we see suffering, to want to help. And that's an innate capacity that resides within all of us. And we are no less worthy of deserving that compassion. That when we are suffering, we are no less deserving of receiving compassion or a desire to relieve that suffering. And I want to explore with us today, there's many myths, whether they're cultural myths or they're religious conditioning or their family of origin conditioning. We live in a hyper-competitive society where many of us were told, unless you use the sort of self-criticism, you're never going to get anywhere, or that self-compassion is weak, or self-indulgent, or we don't deserve this. And in fact, the science of self-compassion has taught us that self-compassion increases accountability. It also supports our capacity for habit change, which is one of the most difficult things that we confront, because changing a habit really takes practice over and over and over again. And when we have self-criticism, that's likely arising from a place of fear rather than loving compassion for oneself. Another myth that we grapple with is that it's selfish, that do I deserve this? I'm caring for another, I'm a care partner for somebody who has challenges that I'm not experiencing. Am I really deserving of this? And in fact, what the science has taught us about this is that self-compassion strengthens and widens your capacity to care for another. And of course, we've all heard that, the description of when you're in the airplane, put your mask on first. And if we're not well and grounded and getting enough rest and taking care of ourselves, we're really not able to be present in our best capacity for those we love, our beloveds who are around us. So Kristen Neff and Chris Germer are the two people who have written and studied this most. And I love this definition really because when we require self-compassion, we give ourselves this compassion not to feel better, but because we feel bad. So let's think about an example of that. So for example, if you have memory challenges and you wanted to remember something and you forgot it, you might feel frustrated with yourself, you might feel disappointed, you could have all sorts of feelings and you're feeling bad. Or for example, let's imagine that you are caring for people with different challenges and you become frustrated or irritable, or you have a sharp tone of voice. You are disappointed in the behavior you enacted. So this is an example also where you might feel badly about your behavior, for example. And so these are examples of, I'm sure people also can imagine when they've had a craving that they have given into and might have a regret for example, that donut that just looked totally delicious and you weren't really hungry, you were about to go to bed, but maybe you found yourself having a bite or two or the donut. So these are examples where we have done something that we're feeling bad about, and that's the instance in which we really need the self-compassion, okay? So there are different steps that are helpful along the path of cultivating this self-compassion. And the first step is really to serve as your own mentor or having kindness. And some people do this by imagining a benefactor. They imagine somebody who's been really kind to them in the past. And by evoking that kindness and feeling seen and heard and understood, they're able to then direct that compassion inward. We're not having a back and forth today, but I'll just pose the question to you. You know, have you ever found that you're kinder towards others than you are towards yourself? And if you imagine that vignette of, for example, losing your temper, you know, I'm sure that you might have been on the receiving end of somebody calling and saying, gosh, I'm so disappointed in myself. I lost my cool, you know, I flipped my lid. And imagine for a moment the tone of voice that you might have for that dear friend in that moment of suffering. You know, that voice of gentle encouragement, that voice of understanding, that voice of, oh, you know, we're all human, we can all make mistakes. And then picture, for example, in your mind's eye, if you yourself did something that you made a mistake. You know, frequently that voice is more self-critical. So this idea of are we kinder towards ourselves than others can really prompt us to listen to our voices inside our heads when we are suffering and to try to cultivate that self-kindness or that mentor or coach who can motivate us, for example, for behavioral change when we haven't been able to succeed at the goal we set for the day, for example, and thankfully we can begin again. The second component, which I touched upon earlier, is our shared common humanity. You know, we all fail, we all make mistakes, we all endure hardships, we all suffer. So we are in that circle of common humanity, and we are as welcome in that circle and as worthy as anyone else. And then thirdly, really mindfulness, which allows us to notice the habits of mind, these habits that have been conditioned over years and years, whether culturally, whether from the perspective of gender, where there are gender expectations about roles and how we should care for one another versus ourselves. So really that present moment awareness can help us to notice and cultivate greater seeing of the patterns, greater clarity and greater balance. So really, what are the truths about self-compassion? Number one, and this is again the science has demonstrated that it builds motivation for behavioral change. It helps us to cultivate a sense of courage, confidence, wisdom, and well-being. And we know that people are happier, they're less stressed out. And thankfully, because of what we call experience-dependent neuroplasticity, which is this wonderful quality of mind such that the things that we practice get stronger. This is happening whether we like it or not. If we're focusing on practicing things that are health promoting, that help cultivate a sense of well-being, we actually can have more well-being. And it takes less effort to do so as we practice over time. What's very important in terms of the practice also is consistency. All right, so I think what I'd like to do is just read really quickly a couple of things and integrate one last very brief integrate mindfulness practice where I'll ask you to close your eyes and sort of synthesize the information through breath awareness. So as you're ready, I'm going to ask you again to gather your attention, resting on the breath. And if it's comfortable to you, to drop your gaze and close your eyes. And Mary can share this slide to you, so that'll be available to you certainly. Okay. So, and so just breathing in through the nose, out through the nose. And then I'd like you to take your hands in front of you and rub them together. Create some heat, generate some heat. Really feel that. Going quickly. Feel the hands, feel the heat. And then separating the hands slightly. And then taking them and either giving yourself a hug on your shoulders or putting your hands on your heart. Just enjoying that self-caring sensation. That tenderness, that warmth. Really feeling that in your body. You're there for you. So imagine a moment, not one that's really intense, but imagine a moment of suffering where you felt frustrated at yourself or disappointed in yourself or ashamed of yourself. And call that to mind. And I would like you to receive this. Say to yourself silently, this is a moment of suffering. Suffering is a part of life. May I be kind to myself in this moment. May I give myself the compassion I need. And really receive that compassion. Okay, as you're ready, opening your eyes. And then we'll just end very briefly. I just invite you guys to, over the next couple of weeks or so, you know, when you notice yourself being self-critical or harsh, or you're suppressing your suffering, you're ignoring your suffering, notice what that feels like. What are these habits of mind? What are you saying to yourself in those instances? And then practice with these three components, the self-kindness, the common humanity, and the mindfulness. How could you offer yourself compassion in those moments? And if it's not available, you can simply ground in the breath or ground in the body. Just take a moment. And these informal practices over time, if we do them consistently, can really replace old habits with newer ones that promote well-being. Okay. So I'm happy to answer questions as they arise.